Introduce you to our next plenary speaker. His name is Roberto Marchesini. He's one of the most eminent philosophers we have in Italy at the moment. He's involved in many different projects. He has a center for post-human philosophy. He has a school for human-animal interaction. I have plenty of stories about him because I was and am still a big fan of him. And some of you are already familiar with my work in zoosemiotics. Now it's time for me to tell you that Roberto is one of my main inspirations. When I was a student in Bologna, I was absolutely impressed by some of his books, Oltre il Muro, Il Concetto di Soglia, and they were very, very mind-blowing for me. So I rate him as one of my main inspirations. Not that this count as anything else than being my inspiration, but definitely that was an important step in my education. And another reason why I very much wanted him to be here is I would not like that in discussing the role of humanities, a possibility for a new paradigm, whatever development challenge, I wouldn't like that we forget that also the known human, whatever alterity, otherness outside the human sphere, is forgotten in the process. We need to address that problem as well. It's a crucial problem, particularly in the current society, in the current status of society, where the forms of relations which often end up in exploitation of other animals is becoming huger and huger. It's part of the crisis, whether we like it or not. So Roberto is going to focus particularly on the notions of animal subjectivity on the one hand and human culture on the other. Human culture is a form of solipsistic process. He will tell you more about this. So even at a purely philosophical level, even if you are not particularly interested in questions of non-human alterity, this should be a very, very intriguing and inspiring lecture for you. So, as I said, it is a great pleasure to invite Professor Roberto Marchesini to the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dario. Good morning. The main aim of post-humanistic philosophy is to bring into question and criticize the humanistic and autarkic idea of autopoiesis of the human dimension. When we talk about autopoiesis, we mean the idea that the human being realizes himself through a creative operation showing his own predicates, which are typical of the human being essence. For autarky, we intend the idea that the human dimension is pure and not a hybrid, confirming that a purative and disjunctive principle which denies whatever dialectic relation with the non-human. First of all, anthropocentrism is an ontological paradigm which starts from the premise that between the human being and the other species there is not a simple predicative difference. At the end, each species is different from the others, but rather a meta-predicative one. This ontological separation, basis of the humanistic anthropocentrism, could be summed up as follows. A dog is different from a cat, but they are both animals. A human being is different from a dog or a cat, but only because he is not truly an animal. This metapredicative difference produces a lot of articulation and is not nearly as simple as its mere expression would let us suppose. This perspective not only separates the term in an ontological way, assigned to opposing domain, but it also defines the term of the anthropopoiesis. That is the construction of the human condition, denying whatever dialogic possibility with the non-human, and in turn affirming the ontopoietic self-referentiality and loneliness of the human being, which are at the base of the autopoiesis and the autarky. The ontological anthropocentrism assumes different forms. The pre-humanistic idea of a predicate, the word, the direct posture, the intellect, the technique, the awareness, capable to operate as an arising factor and thus capable of separating in a new kingdom domain the human from the animal, ontic separation. The humanistic idea of a virtually of the human, that is an absence of functional predicates, idea that range from Pico della Mirandola to Arnold Gehlen, which is able to act as a meta-predicative element, ontological separation. With the humanism, the ontological anthropocentrism acquires a true consistency by means of the explicit genial of the predicate difference. It's not on or more predicates to make the human being special because he is different, but on the contrary, it is the lack of that particular functional declination, the epimeteic character, which characterizes each animal. According to the humanism, the human being is not delineated in a functional way. He is a Promethean. He lacks of an ontic a priori determination, and under this point of view, he is free to be what he wants. The humanistic assumption, which records Prometheus' myth, transforming it into a manifest and ontopoietic project, represents the most complete and prolific expression of the ontological anthropocentrism. This does not mean that the non-human animal is merely emarginated or exploited following the dictates of divine law or simply through the survival of the fittest and the Neolithic heritage of the animal captivity. The humanism makes something more than that. It devaluates the non-human. It implies him of whatever meanings in order to elevate the human being to an auto-determinate entity, totally realized from any external influence. The humanism has an efficient key to separate our species from the other, avoiding the fragile field of the functional predicates, makes the human being deprived of functional declination, and therefore it inaugurates the anthropometric by transforming the human being in a unit of measurement of the world, releasing the human being from the predetermination of nature. It makes him free and owner of himself, binding the human being to a complete openness. But put in his hands the tree of his own fate and transforms him into an autopoietic entity where the dignity is, first of all, self-determination. Through the technological extension, to the functional declination, the human being assumes a lot of forms and potentially becomes a container of the world. Inevitably, the first humanism represents this magmatic entity under a transparent and larval neotenic feature, where human is a tension toward an angel, a taking up of a distance from appetites and organic function, a lightness unhooked from gravitation, but above all, a strength of purity against each non-human contaminant. This angelic dimension discriminates the human from the beast, characterized by being hairy, by a magnification of splachnocranium, thanks to fangs, tongue, and drool, by the sexual excess, and by the strong bond with the ground. The human condition lies in the propensity to let the human elevate toward the sky, divorcing from animality. Since the first syncretist expression, the humanism identified a model or a stereotype of the human being. This was inevitable, considering the polarities angelic versus brutal, which defined their path of realization. For this reason, in its attempt to elevate the human in its complex and at the same time to separate him from the other species, or in humanistic term from the animal, actually gave life to a discriminative operator within the assembly of the human, doing so fixing an omega point where human is complete and counter-term from which to take a leave. It achieves a discriminative operator applicable to human himself. It would be enough to place different individuals and different types and races too along the scale of separation of the animal to obtain a hierarchic scale of the human. The human realizes himself through operation of separation and depuration, the body from a functional declination, the skin from a praxis and gravitational contact with the ground, the pleasure from the appetite and the satisfaction. This is an alchemical operation, an attempt to eliminate the telluric contaminants from the human beings. The humanistic prototype as theorized thus, it needs to separate itself from the land and to disjoint himself from the animal. However, by doing so, it becomes a project more than a realization of fact and a basis of a judgment and segregation, more than a universal and a shared principle. The freedom of the human being is established on the lack of a connection of a natural bond. The human nature is to support and promote this emancipative faith. The greatness and the peculiarity of the human being lies in this becoming human without an Epimethean rank. Each individual has the task to force himself to cut the last legacy which still remains him is upward telos. For the human being to separate himself from the other animals means not only to take up a distance from them, but also to make his body pure from what still is telluric and wild. The humanist builds is a fundamental and ontological project on the separating and elevative dichotomic project, limiting itself to vary the oppositive couples according to diverse philosophical variation, which started to spread from the 15th to the 20th century. Thus, the angels can transform himself or clarity himself into Descartes' res cogitans, into Kant's I think, into Hegel's spirit, or Heidegger's concept of existence. The angel, as an archetype, is able to see the reality because it takes up distance from it, because he is able to fly over it, and therefore is not directly a user like a bee toward the flower. In the humanistic project, the non-human animal, in the form of an animal, is a category concept non-useful to define something realistic individuals of other species, but it has as a unique purpose the ontological explanation of the human being. For this reason, it's possible to consider obsessive the reference to the animal as a counterterm to define human. Thus, we can affirm that the humanistic ontology is founded on speciesist requirements. Speciesism is not a consequence of the humanism, but it is its premise that found it. The ontological anthropocentrism proper of the humanism comes before any form of speciesist discrimination. Therefore, wherever critic to the speciesism, which relies upon humanistic categories, is destined to deep inner contradiction. Often these contradictions are hidden, for example, when we try to apply universal parameter of right to the non-human animals, as happened in Reagan natural law interpretation, or when we base the respect toward other species on the sentience, as happening in Singh's utilitarianism approach, or when we define the anthropocentrism as an ideal condition, as in a utopian vision, in which all the living beings should tend or be known to. The anti-speciesist theories with a humanistic matrix are started by a cryptospecism, where the antispecism demand is only apparent because it is a division expressed by Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, a human being measure and container of the world that dictates the coordinates of interpretation. In order to overcome this ontological anthropocentrism, it's necessary to recall some pre-humanistic philosophies, Lucrezio, Plutarco, or very critical thinkers of the humanism, such as Montaigne. Only by disintegrating the Vitruvian model and overtaking the ontological conception of the humanism, it's possible to define a very antispecism conception. I would like to start from the dichotomy that considers non-human animals as Epimetheus' son and the human being as a Prometheus' son. This dichotomy, which builds to different genealogy from the human being and from the other animal, transforms the human being into an autarkic entity in his expression and realization. The Prometheans realized from Epimetheus' sons start from two wrong assumptions: that the phylogenetic emptiness, that is the absence of a rank, allows freedom to the human beings; that the Promethean expression is emancipative and elevative, which means that it separates the human being from the other species. But before taking into account the two mistakes of the humanistic Promethean, that is the fallacy of the anthropocentric ontology, it's necessary to start from the natural characteristics of the human being who, after Darwin, we accepted as the outcome of a phylogenetic contraction, human as a product of a particular natural trajectory, based on events of correlation with the population on a specific context and lifestyle. So we are not the result of an ad hoc creation, specific and ultimative, but a translation point along one of the many trajectories of life on Earth. Therefore, we strongly reject the first mistake of the humanistic Promethean that runs from Pico della Mirandola to Arnold Gehlen, the idea of an absence of a rank inside the human dimension. To accept the Darwinian conception beyond Darwin, it means that it's not possible to think about a human being as an incomplete, partial, rankless, slick entity, since in nature this assumption is not bearable. As a matter of fact, each deviation, mutation, or discovery does not nullify the selective processes, but just modifies them. Most of the predicates owned by the human being are shared with other species, thus inherited from a common ancestor, homologies, and thus realized from the same selective pre-shared analogies. The human has an adaptive specialization, exactly as all the other species. It has innate tendencies, a specific anatomy, physiology, structure, a proper being immersed into the world, clear this in the ontogenetic emergency of individual identity. This means to start from a fullness situation of human nature and not from a deficitary one, in the sense that we have to recognize that a human being is not completely free or total virtual in the realization of his own identity. Everything that a human being is able to realize is supported and non-obstructed from this phylogenetic fullness. This is not an act of emancipation, but of evolution. To accept a specific nature, that is to say a proper phylogenetic legacy and not the personified nature of the humanist, and to attribute to the nature the worth of a flywheel in the ontogenetic process, it means to replace the amphora to fill up model with another one that we can call network to connect. The amphora model which comes from the humanistic tradition and represent the mainstay of Galen's philosophical anthropology, puts nature and culture in a relation of indirect proportionally, and by doing so, the cultural domain of the human is celebrated thanks to a scarce natural characterization. Once again, we find the classical dichotomy which sees the natural Epimethean qualities fight against the cultural Prometheus one, Epimetheus versus Prometheus, non-human animals versus human being. The network to connect model, more adherent with the ethological and neurobiological research, put the two terms that we use to simplify in a direct proportionally. More complex is the innate dimension, and more complex is the learning dimension. More important is the phylogenetic endowment, and more articulated is the ontogenetic trajectory. In other words, only a generous nature can support similar generous cultural dimension. In fact, the model network to connect tells us that more are the points to be connected and more the action of a relation will be, and at the same time, more will be the possible diverse outcomes of a wiring. To accept a shared path with other species means to treat the expressive predicates emotion, representation, motivation, cognition, not anymore as something which characterizes ourselves, but as a common bricks that the human being shared with the other species. Obviously, according to the criterion and gradient which vary species by species and following the principle of homology or taxonomy proximity and analogies or sharing of selectors. This means to refuse the monological vision from von Uxel to Nagel. The common space are various and similarity huge in the possibility to understand what an individual belonging to another species is feeling. The member of another species is not an alien anymore. A shared area exists that is not limited to the similarity of the apparatuses, to the same inner physiology, to the intimate matrix of histologic structure or to the genetic grammar, but it is related to a inner status which is expressed through a behavioral configuration. I recognize myself, especially in this one. Darwin talked about common expression of emotion, but nowadays we have enlarged the predicate list which support the sharing with the other species. To recognize the joy that a dog feels while he's playing, the curiosity of a cat's attention, the love in the parental care of gorilla. This is not a projective anthropomorphism, but means to admit a community that goes beyond the lower level of the sentience. In these shared areas or areas of sympathy, I can understand the non-human animal in a certain condition because even the human being can live that condition. The sympathy allows me to find a common base, a common feeling or co-feeling in the recognition of ourselves and the other in the shared land of the being animal. The sympathy avoids both Nagel's concept of animal alien, that is unknowable, and von Uxel's concept of animal extraneous, that is an animal close inside his Umwelt, which is different from my Umwelt. The sympathy allows me to apply a critical anthropomorphism, the identification that those predicates belong not only exclusively to the human being. Moreover, the sympathy never ends in itself, but it's a starting point in order to assume a real biocentric attitude. Studying for these shared predicates and applying the adaptative principle, it's possible to interpret also statuses which do not belong to us or statuses of empathy. Subjective is a starting in the world and engaging problems which are common from the being animal condition, such as to learn, to defend himself, to eat, etc., and to do them in a specific way. The biocentrism means to recognize the polycentrism of being animal, the idea that each species and each individual modify in a singular way his own being in the world, and that he takes the problem of the animal condition. The problem of the expressive diversity is important in order to understand the proper nature of each species or individual, but it's a false problem if there is the identification of the subjectivity, because this does not depend from the predicative characterization. The dog and the cat have different predicates, but they are both subject. At the end, the cognitive function answers to the same requirement of operative specialization as the perception or the digestion. The mind replies to the same principle, to realize an adaptative speciesist function, to perceive, to digest, but the mind modifies the answer according to the particular needs of a species. As it's not the ability to see ultrasound which makes an animal perceptive. It is not the specific cognitive function to declare his subjectivity as well. We don't not subject the non-human animal on the base of knowledge, but on the base of philosophical prerequisite. This is demonstrated by the fact that when, in the half of the 20th century, the separation between human and non-human animal was increasing under the pressure of existentialism and philosophical anthropologies. The increased knowledge in ethology and psychology were not enough to avoid the machine explanation of the non-human animal. Indeed, in this period, the behavioristic associationism and the psychohydraulic model of classic ethology took vigor. The animal object in science-intensive farms as well as in the houses is subjected to an objectification that even Descartes could have never imagined. The non-human animal becomes an object along the way of recursive movements between speciesist ideology and praxis, where a wordless and idle cooperation finds first movements. Humanist does nothing more than building a coherent frame to this project of ontological anthropocentrism. The animal becomes a malleable and ergonomic tool in the hands of the Promethean human. The reification of the non-human, typical of the humanistic paradigm, is functional to make the human being emerge as a protagonist. To reach this goal, he has to transform everything else into a background. The background is motionless in its movement. It's not regulated by an history, but by a mechanical organization. It does not choose or decide. It does not have memory, and it lacks of any planning possibility. It does not forecast. It does not simulate, and as a consequence, it's not able to prevent. To desubject the non-human animal means to take off the soul from an animal, transforming him into a set of functions where each one is autonomous in the expression of certain predicates. During the long humanistic itinerary, the way to describe, explicate the non-human background have been many, without bringing into question the status of being a backdrop of other species. The epimetheism is not interpreted as a reflection function, a total comprehension of the being animal inside a function, a deep and direct immersion in the fruition, and thus it cannot take up that distance from the world that allows him and not throws him or a disinterested gaze. According to the humanistic approach, the animal is so immersed in the world that it is unable to contemplate it as expressed by Heidegger's concept of an animal power of word. And as you can see, Heidegger did nothing more than bring into extreme consequence what was already expressed by Pico della Mirandola. He did not criticize the humanistic anthropocentrism, but its law register. The focus of the discussion is in the analysis of the epithemism, the humanistic reading of animal behavior, the science that at last follows the coordinates of a humanist, is looking for a mechanistic explanation in line with the concept of a background. Therefore, the epimetheum predicate is interpreted as a ride that moves the animal puppet, a switch which turns on, off a function. These are the explanatory modes called into question in concepts like instinct and conditioning. The humanistic paradigm denies to the being animals the ownership of the epimetheum predicate. The animal subjectivity is not have an endowment, a certain fruition, but this one becomes the switch that moves in a mechanical way the desubjectivity animal. Therefore, it is nonsense to discuss about predicates. If it's a meta-predicate structure that distinguishes the human being from the non-human animal. There is not a predicate so complex that it cannot be transformed into a switch. To give back subjectivity to the non-human animal, it's not enough to refer to the predicate complexity, but it's indispensable to recognize its ownership of its own endowments. The other, who belong to another species, and I are subject in the sense that we use our functional endowments. The other and I belong to the same way of being, even though we express in different manners. The non-human animal is an alternative because it is an other from me, but it does not have the character of strangeness. The humanistic philosophy persists on its metapredicative difference. The human being is free, while the animal is normed by laws of nature. The subjective is the ability to hold in the hands the rights of the own nature. It is not sufficient to have efficient efficacy function. It is indispensable to continuously know how to use them according to each situation. The reason is the principle of singularity of the real, which was put into light by several authors during the second part of the 20th century. The first was Ilya Prigozhin, who put aside Laplace's demon to affirm the openness toward the future. That is the sample confirmation about the fact the situation followed the similarity and non-identity principle. The functional endowments, even if extremely complex and elaborated, are not enough if the subject does not adjust them constantly to the change that each situation proposes in its being unique and singular. The man puts me in the world and it makes me face the reality, defining the specific threshold of exchange and processing information. But above all, the mind sets the margin of news that the principle of singularity of the real arranges. This is true for the human being as well as for the non-human animal. It's not the awareness that makes a non-human animal endowment with subjectivity, but it's the ownership of its endowments. Therefore, the subjectivity is not related to the ownership of a particular predicate, but on the ownership of its endowments. If a dotation was responsible of itself about the function, it should be treated as an automatism. These were the instincts and conditioning, and it would not make sense to talk about subjectivity. The subjectivity implies the possibility of choosing the modality of use of an endowment, which in turn needs to be able to forecast a more functional possibility. The subjective requires that it is not possible to discern the function from the structure of the endowment. The epimetic predicate is handled by humanism as a mechanism, and the non-human animal is transformed into a particular element of the background, which is regulated by inflexible laws. If the animal endowment is a sort of switch, as expressed by the behaviorist association chain of stimulus response or by the mechanism of case signals of the classical ethology, there is not room from the subjective, because once the structure is given, the function is given too. This is because the relation between the two terms, structure and function, is a one-to-one. In this case, the non-human animal works as a robot, a sort of clock, but more complex than it. The subject arises where the endowment in itself is not able to explain that ability of consistent adjustment, which requires freedom to use, the possibility of choose, flexibility in expression, cooptation toward new use, creativity in the realization of new endowments, diachronic presence in situation. The non-human animal has its own here and now moment because it's not completely assimilated from him. The human animal is the owner of its endowments because they are not able to explain exhaustively his behavior. In the endowments is not explained as an automatism, but as a knowledge. Things change. A knowledge is not a switch, but a tool which forces more function given to the subject, which utilizes freedom of choice and of adjusting it according to the occurrence. We can think it as a multifunctional schema, where the relation structure function is 1 to infinite. As a map of a city searcher, which does not involve an itinerary function, but infinitely possible paths. The non-human animal has the ownership of these paths because he is utilizing them and not vice versa. When crossing the singularity of reality, when managing a new situation, the subject uses his endowments in a plural, flexible, and creative way. Only at the time the mechanical and the Cartesian vision of the non-human animal decays, and we can talk about subjectivity. So we can say that the subjectivity arises from the not deterministic character of the cognitive endowments. In this sense, we can say that also we can and should talk about the phylogenetic legacy that we can define as a sense, but only in order to force the concept and make it shift from a prototype to a range of possibility. It is always the subject that is a protagonist of his own individuality. Thus, we can affirm that the non-human animal as an individual exists, following Heidegger and Sartre vision, as he arises and possesses that legacy and uses it according to his personal and particular presence in the here and now. Therefore, the animal's subjectivity means to admit that behind the predicates, senses, reflexivity, awareness, theory of the mind, the non-human animal has an ownership of his endowments, which makes him emerge toward his predicates. He exists because he always emerges from the bubble where von Uxel put him. To face it with the singularity of the real, he needs a status of continuous emergency from the bubble, which means that it's necessary to possess an here and now. He exists because in his individual outcome of lived experiences and of the one in which he is projecting, it substantiates the sense and not the contrary. However, in order to admit this fact, it's necessary to do not less go astray from the research of those predicates called to be a key test to affirm the subjectivity of non-human animals, if we understand that the humanistic specimen is based on a meta-predicate. That is what needs to be called into question. This means that the non-human animal has to be considered as a partner of a dialogic relation and not an object that has to be known. Here, we face up with a very deep shift in the epistemological tradition and interpretation, which start from a self-referred conception of a human knowledge that is inevitably narrowed by deductive and inductive bottlenecks. According to the humanism, the animal object has to be known from the human being as a subject which inevitably is alone in the learning process. To admit the existence of a subjective in non-human animals means to put the basis for a dialogic epistemology. Thus, we can affirm that the first aspect that comes into question from the post-humanistic philosophy is this ontological separation between a human and non-human. The post-humanistic philosophy intends to overtake the dichotomy of Epimetheus versus Prometheus, which is at the base of Adorno's oppositional humanist dichotomy: natural, culture, class freedom, innate learning, moral instinct. The post-humanistic philosophy does not rejecting the meta-predicator of the double genealogy in the name of a common being animal that exceeded these dichotomies, but not inside a reductionist division of the human being as a machine too, but as an identification of the subjective of the non-human. If the non-human animal recognized as a subject and not as object of background can be considered an alterity, also the human identity can be put into question if we can apply to the non-human animal the emergencies of the existence which turn into a speaker. Inevitably we recognize in it the referential presence that Levinas conferred exclusively to the human. But in doing so, the boundary that guarantees an ontological purism with the humanist attributes to the human being inevitably falls. When the other species becomes alterity, also the human identity withstands a drastic ontological shift. We have seen how the humanist constructs the human ontology on the purity requirement that is juxta propria principia. The non-human universe is the background and therefore it receives, but it does not damage, not contain the human cosmopolis. Even the technique that Prometheus put in the human hand is at all a sort of mud limited to release human goals and that empowers and extends her opera failed. The humanist has an ergonomical and instrumental vision of technique, but for humanists all becomes technique and at hand, but there is nothing that cannot be turned into an instrument. If the non-human animal is recognized as a speaker, the human being holds his autarkic and autopoietic condition, since the non-human animal as partner of the dialogical relation is not anymore an object to study, but a counter-term to interact with a dialogical and referential relation. The post-humanistic philosophy recognizes that in the human dimension there are many non-human elements, meaning that those we define as human predicates actually have been realized with the contribute of the non-human. The post-humanistic perspective, with the rejection of the genealogical separation, not only interprets the being animals in a different way, but it also sees the human dimension as an hybrid outcome. The points of continuity between the humanism and the post-humanist exist. Surely, here I would like to remember the ICoN conception of the being, the emergence vision of subjectivity, the non-deterministic interpretation of the human. However, the differences are far more striking. First of all, there is the recognition of a characteristic human nature and those of an epimetic content in the human being, which is not negligible. Being the son of a phylogenetic of other species, the human being has his own rank, his own adaptive specialization. In this perspective that I presented in the same post-human, I affirm that it's not possible to deny a strong characterization of the human nature. On the other hand, according to the post-humanistic philosophy, nature is not a isochronic instrument, the clock of Descartes and Laplace. Nature is not deterministic, it's not a background, it's not an entity from which to derive a universal laws. Nature is plural, creative, historical, artificial, cognitive, non-equilibrated, transcendent. For all these reasons, to affirm the complexity of the human nature does not mean to transform the human being in a puppet moved with string, but it means to give a substance to the subjectivity. The human nature is what allows the human being to go beyond his own nature. It's difficult to choose between the various predicates which make the human being particularly susceptible to the hybridization with the non-human. A strong accumulating inclination which made him adopt cups of another species, inserting them in a continuous way in his social group. They make the mimetic tendency that makes us sure that the human being will play to imitate whatever thing, and in turn the human will reproduce in his own body choreographic styles and non-human postures. A hatred competitiveness which often creates feelings between the envy and the emulation, which bring the human to always strive to be the best among the others and keep on accepting new changes. The man is like a container. He tries to build categories and to utilize the external world as a category operator, meaning that he tries to find possible grammars that he can use to give a sense of order of the world. Surely these factors have contributed because each one of them breaks the isolation of the human being, favoring the interjection of the non-human predicates inside the human assembly. On the other hand, in my opinion, a very important inclination in order to understand the hybridative process of the human being is the tendency to externalize the function. This characteristic is already manifested in its cause in gorilla and chimpanzee, and is further developed in the Australopithecine, and it reaches a unique consistency in the animal kingdom in the hominine. The tendency to externalize transforms the interpretation of the external entity thanks to an instrument to shift the famous femur in space. To externalize means to bring out a function. Actually, according to the post-humanistic vision, the process is considered more as an introjection of the entity. The chipped stone of the bone become integral part of the body, and they receive a neurobiological projection and ad hoc awareness as if they are personified. The external entity is infiltrative, not only because it receives a somatization, but because it modifies its morphological and functional arrangement of the body itself, acting on all the system and not just on the central nervous system, as the predicate is not simply strengthened but modified. Actually, the outsourcing is an infiltration. The technique is far from being ergonomic, adaptive to the body, and it is metamorphic. It adapts the body to itself. Thus, the tool is not a devoted slave anymore, but a virus that enters the human cell and modifies its internal metabolism. Since the cell is not recognizable for its genome, but because of its metabolome, we can say that the external entities modify the human identity in its complex. The post-humanist approach is the recognition of this principle of hybridization in the human ontology. What decades are the concept of autopoiesis and autarky. If the heritage of the human being, the phylogenetic legacy, or the absence of anthropos are put upside down by the hybridative event, we have to recognize that the human ontology is not the outcome of an anthropocentripetative process, but of an anthropocentrifugative one. In other words, each time the human being hybridizes with cell an external entity, he anthropodecentrizes himself. Sadly, alleging his sphere to interface with the external reality, but at the same time moving away from his gravitational phylogenetic center. Therefore, to read the ontology in an anthropocentric way is literally a nonsense because the process has exactly the opposite direction. What is the role of the other species in this process of hybridization? In my opinion, it is huge, and I have been supporting this perspective for many years. Most of the cultural expression of the human being are nothing more than the incorporation of animal knowledge, dance, music, fashion, architecture, technology, just to cite some of them. We are the animal that hybridize the most with the other species, and paradoxically, we profess an autarkic ideology in the ontological explication. But we are wrong if we think that these legacy are the outcome of a simple imitation. When we talk about the soul imitation, we are saying two things. That the ideas belonging to the human being, which was simply limited to learn the art of realizing those ideas from an animal. That it has just been a technical or instrumental transposition, meaning that the technique has been translated from the animal which presented it. In my opinion, both these statements are wrong. To observe a bird flying does not mean to learn the art of flight, but to learn that it's possible to fly. Therefore, a bird flight has to move from the status of a phenomenon, something to admire or to envy, something or other than mean, to a condition of epiphany. Epiphany stands for an aspiration, an annunciation of a possible existential dimension. First, the human being needs to see himself flying in the wing of the bird. He needs to project himself in that flight and to make emerge an ornithomorphic dimension so that the flight is transformed in other with me. Only successfully the human can consider the flight as the art of flying. From my point of view, the animal epiphany is the biggest anthropopoietic operator, because it is the process that allows the human being to enhance in his existential dimension and in turn allowed the human to anthropo-decentralize himself. The animal epiphany followed project routes, such as the one of the flight, but it also followed the routes of possession, such as in the dance, where the acting like an animal of the human is realized because the movement of the animal enters the body of the human being, inducing the human to make movements which do not belong anymore to both the animal and the human. According to the post-humanistic reading, the human condition, being an ontological and anthropoietic dimension, is the hybrid outcome which derives from the graft of the non-human reference in the ontopoietic nucleus of the human being. We talk about ontopoietic nucleus in order to refer to an evolutionary unstable entity, which is strongly dialectical with the alterities and similarly introjective of external references. That is like because of the phylogenetic characteristics of our species and of the instability effect, and in turn because of the openness of two contaminations given by previous hybridization. Therefore, the other species comes into the ontology of the human being, have the role of referential alterities, which are cofactorial entities in the construction of the human dimension, acting on the ontopoietic nucleus in an epiphanic way, which means by inspiring a new possible existential dimension. That action in anthropocentrative enlarges the ontopoietic nucleus and making it less gravitated on the phylogenetic dimension, and in turn making it more unstable and more sensible to other hybridization. Therefore, the other species come into the ontology of the human being, having the role of referential alterities, which are cofactorial entities in the construction of the human dimension, acting on the ontopoietic nucleus in an epiphanic way, which means by inspiring new possible existential dimension. That action is anthropo-decentrative, enlarging the ontopoietic nucleus and making it less gravitating on the phylogenetic dimension. in turn making it more unstable and more sensible to other hybridization. But at the same time, the action is anthropoietic, favoring them to become human, and the emergence of predicates that more that we recognize as an expression of the human being in which we can recognize ourselves. Therefore, the post-humanistic philosophy does not deny the becoming of the human and its historicity, but it defines him not in a separative and elevative way in respect to the non-human, but in a conjugative and hybridative way, inserting the non-human animals in the ontopoietic dialectic dimension. Thank you. Sono stato lungo.
I couldn't find the microphone. It's here.
È andato.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for this great presentation. And let us take a couple of questions, and then we'll take a coffee break. I promised Roberto to be a translator. Anybody?
Zdzisław Wąsik, Poznań and Wrocław in Poland. So I'm also interested in this problem, the distinction between animals and humans, maybe from this post-humanistic perspective, yes? And you mentioned also Uexküll, you mentioned also Heidegger. I think that you elaborate more on Uexküll and on the philosophers who took stand to it. For example, there is a book of Brett Buchanan from the University of State University of New York in Buffalo. Yes, he discusses. Well, I have it in the information here, but I can provide it. So he also discusses Merleau-Ponty in this context and Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze distinguished all organisms, but not in the view of function, but rather the relations of organism towards the reality, and then we can make a classification. How many relationships, how we have affected others, and how the others have affected us, even including stones, that they are in relation with us. Mm-hmm. Yes, all objects. And then I noticed maybe one mistake, because you mentioned Volati 2002, you probably mentioned the book of Roberto Marchesini, yes, published in the Volati publishing house, yes.
Se vuoi commentare.
L'unica cosa è c'è sempre questa differenza tra determinato, completamente determinato dalla natura, o completamente libero e indeterminato. Il mio punto di vista è che la natura non ti determina completamente, e quindi è completamente indeterminato dalla natura.
In questo senso. I just wanted to understand.
Yeah, okay, so Roberto is saying that there is always this question of predeterminate from nature and determinate by the subject. So this is like the key of his distinction.
Subjective viewpoint to account, yes. And then the distinction between a person, animal, and an alien. Yes, this was mentioned here. And also, I would advise you, if you take into account the linguistic studies of Charles Roquette in America, because he gave lectures in the anthropology, and he elaborated a number of distinctions between animals and humans.
Thank you. Any other question? No? Well then, that means you were very, very clear.
So, thank you once more, Roberto, and I invite you everybody for a coffee break.